There we go. And then we'll send this over. There we go. All right, perfect.
Great.
All right, great, Karen. It's all yours.
Okay, awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Managing the Process of Migrating to SharePoint Online. I'm currently a Teams aficionado right now. I'm all into Teams too, but SharePoint is definitely something that I've been doing up until just a few months ago. And as I was just introduced, I'm Karen Dredske. I am a Microsoft Service Adoption Specialist. I also have a certification in SharePoint 2013, which is outdated at this point, as well as I am a certified Scrum product owner. So I've done a lot of project management, I've done a lot of migrations, and I've worked in all different versions of SharePoint. The first time I worked in SharePoint, it was SharePoint 2003 Portal Server, which is a really long time ago. And I have done migrations between the different SharePoint platforms, and also most recently, it's been mostly from SharePoint 2007 or 2010 up to SharePoint Online. I've worked with 2019 on-prem and 2013 on-prem as well. And so I have a lot of migration experience as far as managing the entire process goes. Personally, this year I've become a gardening novice. I have a humongous garden in my yard, and I'm excited about that. And hopefully I will become as good at gardening someday as I am at running projects that involve Microsoft 365 and especially SharePoint. One of the things that I would like to do is I would like to know who my audience is, because that's part of the migration process. And for me, when I present, it's part of my process as well. So what I'm actually going to do is I want to share a link. I have a Microsoft form set up, as you can see here, if I can find my cursor. And let me share the link to that. Hopefully that shows up. If all of you would not mind, I would really appreciate it if you would just hop on over to this form and let me know where you are in the process. Are you just planning? You're thinking about moving to SharePoint Online, and that's why you're here to learn more. You've already made a plan and you're getting ready to start. You're in the middle of migrating, or have you already done it and you want to see if there's something that you can do better the next time, or that you can learn for managing the process next time? I'm also interested in what version of SharePoint you're migrating from. I know support's pretty much gone unless you have a special extension for SharePoint 2007, but all of the other versions on up, you certainly would be able to migrate. And then I'm also interested in whether you happen to be moving to the commercial cloud or the government cloud. They're coming closer together, but they are different. And any information that you guys share would be great. And a little bit further in the process, we will take a look at who all is here. I'm sure it'll all be anonymous information, but it will be helpful so that I can target some of my presentation to what your needs might be. So here is what basically the process is, and this is our agenda for today. I have a 5-step process that I go through when we're doing a migration, and I have to plan it out. And these are the different areas that they're in. It's back up so I don't miss anything here. Regardless of whether you're going to the commercial cloud or you're going to the government cloud, the process should be the same. It's just what your functionality will be, and maybe some of your risks that you have to identify and manage might be a little bit different. We're going to talk about more of those as we go through today. So let's start out talking about the first phase of planning this process. And it actually has 3 pieces to it. As you can see here: review, evaluate, and plan. And then we have to figure out how we're going to run all of it. And it's really critical because the planning part, when we get to that stage, really makes or breaks how successful your migration is. I've done migrations for a number of companies. Most of my SharePoint experience has been with a company called Seskutech, who was acquired by Protiviti. And you might be familiar with both of those names. They're in the Washington, D.C. area. Then after that, what I did is I did a couple of consulting gigs to do specifically migration for SharePoint to the cloud for Booz Allen, who I'm sure everybody has probably heard of, great company. I assisted them with a lot of SharePoint 2007 to SharePoint Online. And when we went through this process, the biggest thing we found is you could really break down your migration into whether it's going to be simple or it's complex. Depending on what your users are using SharePoint for, the simple ones are oh so easy, and I hope for all of you that that's really what you have more of. And that's where everybody's using just out of the box SharePoint sites. No special configuration to the graphics, no special page layouts, no special templates, no crazy permissioning where you have a million different individual users who have individual rights to documents and lists and items on lists. And everything is set up with groups, and preferably network security groups, so that it was really easy to set up those permissions and they all inherited down. Then you didn't have any external users that you had to worry about authenticating, and that when those folks are in there working with their content, they're using basic out-of-the-box web parts with no customizations. They're just custom configured. If you have something like that, your migration is going to be a piece of cake. It might take some time depending on how much content there is, but it really will be pretty simple and relatively painless. It'll probably take you more time to train everyone and get them used to the environment and adopting than it will for anything else. Now, if those are not all of the cases or all of the features of what you're dealing with your migration, then you're probably looking at a complex migration. And they can get very complex depending on which of these items you have. Certainly workflows don't migrate very well. In the migrations that I've done, we just didn't even try to migrate workflows. If they're simple ones, some of the basic publishing workflows work pretty well, depending on the tool that you're using to migrate. But workflows are not great. And we've also, in fact, just, I believe it was the beginning of the month, Microsoft announced that if you're in SharePoint 2010 and you're using SharePoint 2010 workflows, that those are not going to be available any longer up in the cloud. And they're going to be turned off by default. And the ones, anybody who's using them now, you need to upgrade your workflows. So if you have workflows, you're going to be needing to think about alternatives already, unless you're using something like Nintex, which creates a whole nother basket of complexity to everything. Custom forms. I know that if you're working in the government, there are a lot of folks, well, and even if you're not, a lot of folks have really adapted InfoPath, and the retirement for InfoPath has been pushed out and out, but I think will eventually come to an end. So if you have custom forms, you're going to have to worry about those, because customizations just don't transfer really well. If you have custom user interfaces, if it's just colors are easy. If you've got a lot of custom page templates and everything, you're going to have to rethink that. Permissions. Again, if we've got lots of detailed permissions where you've got independent users, individual users that are being connected, that's going to create some complexity to your migration, because you've got to migrate all of those users as well. Then there are always the things, are you integrating with any other systems? Have you purchased any third-party applications or plugins for SharePoint, third-party web parts? And if you have them, are those web parts available with SharePoint Online or not? Or are you going to have to reconsider it? Or maybe if you're lucky, you acquired them to make it easy to do something that SharePoint didn't do in the version you're in, but when you go to SharePoint Online, now it's available by just configuring it out of the box. We're going to cross our fingers that that's what you have. And then there are external users. If you are a commercial company and you happen to have clients who work in the government, specifically what we ran into with Booz Allen was when we had some clients that we wanted to give access to SharePoint, but they were in DoD and in a very secure part. And because of their government cloud requirements, government cloud doesn't talk to commercial cloud. Just wasn't an option, period. And then they had additional security requirements. We actually ended up having to stand up an on-prem setup in order to be able to accommodate those external users. So you may even have to look at something like that. So really, there's a lot of evaluation that has to go in here once you decide whether you have a simple or you have a complex migration that you're dealing with. Now, I'm not a developer. I'm a super user. I absolutely can come up with all kinds of good stuff, but when it comes to the actual technical part of migrating all of that, leave it to your techies. Let them make the plan. Now, you're going to need some information if you're planning this, or you might need to help them with the plan. You're going to have to come up with whether you're doing something. Are you going strictly online? Do you need to do a hybrid situation? Or maybe you need to do SharePoint 2019 on-prem, depending on what your requirements are. So you're going to have to work together to come up with that. You're going to need them to go through and find out how much data is there. They can certainly go through and run a script and find out how many gigabytes or terabytes are you talking about? Because when you're moving to the cloud, one of the things we're going to talk about is the time that it takes. And knowing what the size of the files, the literal file size of your migration is going to help you determine what the length of time is that it takes to do that. So how much data is there? How much time do you have to do the migration? Do you have requirements, business requirements from senior management or someone in your organization that is putting pressure on you to get it done within a certain amount of time, where you have to try to figure out if you have to make adjustments to how you're going to do the migration? Do you have help from the site owners? I'm assuming that if you're doing this, that there are people who own the different parts of the sites in your SharePoint environment. Have you already got buy-in from them? Are they planning to participate, or is this one of those situations where they go, oh, hey, yeah, you guys are going to migrate us, just let us know when you're done? Hopefully not that, because you really do need their assistance as well. And again, we're back to, do we need to have external users who can get in? And if we do, what's the process going to be? Because it's going to have to utilize Azure, and there are a couple of different ways to do authentication, but we're talking about money being involved as well. So a lot of times you're going to have to be thinking about governance related to that also. So once you've kind of evaluated what you have, do you have complex? Do you have a simple site migration? How much do you have to move? What are all the moving parts? Do we have extra connectivity, third-party apps or web parts? Then we need to think about our users. Who are the stakeholders in this? And part of that also is going to be, of course, senior management. It's going to be your content owners, the people who have to manage the content going forward, who haven't worked in the new environment. Although if you're working on a newer version of SharePoint, maybe they've seen something similar, or maybe you are using a modern page layout. Your content managers, and they're also the content consumers, the people who are going to be then utilizing any applications or any content that's in any of your SharePoint sites. This moment, what I would also like to say is that while we're doing this presentation, you're my stakeholders. So I'm going to hope that some of you went over and filled out the form. Let's see if there are any responses here. Refresh. Oh, good, we did. All right, so let's see what we've got here and see what kind of people we have in here. So we have 3 people who are thinking about moving. We've got some that are in the middle of planning, some in the middle of migration. And all right, we have 1 person who's already migrated. Woohoo. And we're looking at 2010. 2013 will be much easier than 2010. 2016, great. And some of us are already on there. That's fantastic. And most of us are going to the commercial cloud, but it's kind of split. Awesome. Let me go back to my slides here. All right, so knowing that, it means that some of us, all of us, are going to have management that's going to be giving us requirements or maybe a timeline. If we're considering it, you're going to want to include management and have them understand what the process is going to be and what it's going to require, what you're going to need. You're going to need some technical folks, and preferably you will have a SharePoint migration specialist, someone who's gone through the process before. If all of you are working on this and you haven't gone through a migration to the cloud before, and if you're working on like 2010, where the interface is not the same as it is in SharePoint Online with all of the modern sites, then you may want to look at giving yourself additional time to learn those things if you're not going to have someone on your team who already knows how to do that. You're going to need to be able to work with your content owners and process owners and content managers to get them to assist and not have and set expectations so that they know they're going to have to participate in order for this to be successful, as well as you're going to potentially have to worry about what the user experience is for the consumers of the content that you're migrating. So first off, when you're talking about your stakeholders, within that group, the people who actually use SharePoint, whether they are on the receiving end or they are managing the content, do you have anybody there who's a point of contact? It really works well if you have someone for each group that you're migrating SharePoint content for, to have a representative who can be the go-between, who can work with you on what the plan is, but who also understands their process. When we have a complex site, a lot of times it's because we have workflows and lots of other processes going on, which means that somebody's using it for an application. They're modifying, they're running a business process through it, storing, making approvals. Maybe they're presenting specific information, and you have to be very careful about who can see it and who can't. Tracking. I know a lot of us use SharePoint for tracking projects, tracking dates, tracking when things happen. It's really good to have a subject matter expert on what those processes are to interact with you. It will be really great because also having them as part of the team of users, it will help to expose them to what they're going to be getting in the end, and they'll have some say, and they'll feel like if they're participating in the process that they're part of what makes it a success. Again, we were talking about the technical team. Make sure you have some folks who actually know how to do everything. If you don't, make sure you've got some sharp people who will be able to learn it quickly and attend events like this in order to find out what all the differences are. And then remember that in order to be successful with your migration, you need to find out what makes it successful. If we just pick up the old site, we move it into a new site, and we say, oh, we don't even want to evaluate whether we're going to use modern pages. We're just going to move a classic site into a new classic site up in the cloud. We're going to try to make their content look exactly one for one the same. That's it. We're not going to do a bunch of training. You're not going to have as much success as if you have people participate and you ask them what's going to work for them. Now, I look at these migrations as an opportunity as well. It is a really, really great opportunity for your IT or IS department or your group to be able to provide extra value to the business or the organization. It's an opportunity to talk to them about cleaning out old content. If you've got tons and tons and tons of content that might need to be retained for legal reasons, but that no one's really using, archive it. Decide, do you really need to migrate it? Because if you don't put it on some other storage that's less expensive than having to store it in the cloud. So consider that. Maybe find out if the process, the system that they're using right now, does it meet the business process needs? Because if you have to make changes when you do the migration to the cloud, it's an opportunity to improve that business process for those users. I know I ran into where users were using SharePoint, they had done all kinds of modifications and customizations to it to try to support their business process, but there were things that were missing, things that they needed to have added that didn't happen online in their system, but then it caused them to have to do lots of manual emails, lots of up and down with training, changing documents out, and a lot of extra manual work. So when we went and did the migration for them, by having a subject matter expert from that team work with us, we were able to identify what did we need to migrate to get them the same level of functionality, but what were the things that they really needed so that when they rolled out this new SharePoint site to their clients, that it would be improved in a way that would make the process not just easier for the end users, but it would also make the process easier for them, so that they didn't have to do as much manual work and they could have more time to handle their clients. So we went through all of that and I identified what that would be. Those are the kinds of things you want to understand, is what will make this a success, so that when you're done, people will look at you and go, oh my God, I'm so glad we did this. This is wonderful. It brought value to me, versus, wow, I know we had to do it, but what a pain, because I've got to change everything that I do now. Those are the kinds of things. It's how you set expectations with everyone. So to get all of that done, next part of the process is scheduling some meetings. So all of the things we've talked about, you're going to have to talk to your stakeholders. You're going to have to come up with what those success criteria are, discuss timelines and what those requirements are, understand the costs, and also talk about how governance is going to work. Are you going to run governance the same way you currently do? If you don't have governance in your current site, it's a great time to add it. Discuss your users, make sure you understand who they are, that you've got those business processes documented. And I have listed here business process mapping, and that is because I am a firm believer that a picture speaks way more than a bunch of words do. In one picture, someone can identify things that are missing rather than having to read a book. Make sure you gather all of the feature requirements. That means understand what's currently there. If you don't have documentation, try to find someone who either has worked on the system technically, and or someone who's been with the business long enough with that team to understand what is going on there. What's the workflow? What kinds of things are happening? Are they using check-in, check-out? Are they doing collaborative work together or not? Who needs to have access to what, understanding the permissions that you're going to need. And when you're working with them, give them demonstrations of what's coming, what kinds of features are in the new SharePoint Online. As well as I have demonstrations listed here, because part of what you're going to do moving forward when you plan meetings with your users and your subject matter experts and your stakeholders is you're going to be demoing to them if you want to have the most success possible. Then, of course, you have your team meetings. You're going to have to schedule your weekly, or maybe you have a daily stand-up. Hopefully, if you're using a Scrum process, you'll have to write your requirements. If you're using Jira and Scrum or another task board, and even if it's in Project, you're going to want to keep track of all your requirements. You're going to review them with your team and your developers as they're making updates, changes, setting things up. You're all going to be wanting to get together and interact and demonstrate what you're doing. So there's lots of meetings involved here. Along with that, let's identify the risks and how to manage those. After that, we've talked about some of the things that are going to change, but there'll be a whole lot more as we go through. Technical issues that I've run into frequently first start out with, are you going to use the new modern SharePoint site pages that are available, or do you need to go classic? With that, sometimes it's really hard. You have to look at what people currently have, and if you've got SharePoint sites where people have lots of lists, lots of libraries with lots of metadata, especially data lists where you have 15 columns of information that people are creating views and basically changing their view to get a report and to export data from, you're going to be hard pressed getting those folks to agree to go to a classic view. If you've got customized web parts, it means that if you want to go to a modern view, you're going to have to rethink how you're formatting them, and you're going to have to rebuild them, because most of us who've got custom classic web parts, we've deployed them with solutions, and you're not going to be able to do that in the new environment. You're going to have to be working from the front end instead of the back, and rethink the way that you're doing it. So that's the first thing, and probably the biggest thing that you have to decide. We also ran into content type restrictions. If you are someone who understands content types in SharePoint and the underpinnings of SharePoint and the architecture, when we are building templates for libraries and lists. Many times, those of us who understand how SharePoint works will use content types. We'll create that with site columns or fields, and users will see that in custom forms. When they go to add information, they'll be presented with lots of fields to fill out about what either the data they're entering is, or information about the kind of document they're adding to a library. I think the biggest thing we found during migration was the most difficult one was when we decided to migrate libraries and lists where the content types were not at the site level or the site collection level, they were on the list or library themselves. What we discovered was we could not migrate the content type from list to list, from on-prem to SharePoint in the cloud. So that created a lot of extra work. We had to manually create those lists, and then we could create the data. Or what we did at one point was some of the guys would take and we would create all of the content types and all of the site columns at the site level in SharePoint Online. And then we would do the migration and add the content type later. But otherwise, you're ending up rebuilding a lot of the structure behind lists and libraries when we're talking about content types. You can't do the same thing in SharePoint Online that you can do on-prem on your server yourself. Custom forms are, of course, affected by that, and we talked briefly about info path forms. If you've got custom forms, you're going to want to really think about whether or not you are going to want to bring that directly over, because you're not going to be able to easily migrate the custom form. You can get the forms over, but you're going to end up in SharePoint Designer doing a lot of updates, taking out controls, recreating controls using the new ones. Now, if you decide you want to go with the modern experience, there are some configurations that are nicer, easier to use for setting up custom forms, but it doesn't take long before you find that you don't have everything that you need. So learning how to decide if you want to continue to use custom development to modify SharePoint, or do you want to use Power Apps? So if you haven't explored Power Apps and you have custom forms, you're going to want to do that. Same thing with workflow. You're going to want to start getting to know Power Automate, unless you happen to be using Nintex. Now, I've not done a migration utilizing Nintex, but I understand that if you are using a migration tool like ShareGate does account for that. And I will freely admit ShareGate is my migration tool of choice at this point. But that, again, is because I'm not a developer. I am a super user and a business user. And if you want to get additional help from some of the folks on your team that are not as technical, ShareGate's an awesome way to do it. I've used Metalogix before. It's a great tool. And for some of the things that we did, it was overkill. And the hardest part, I think, was that we really had to have somebody who knew Metalogix to get it set up and configured right. And once it was set up and configured, and they could go, okay, this is the process. Now, when you migrate a site, go through and do this and this and this and this and this, and gave us step-by-step instructions. Anybody could do it. However, then when you ran into problems, you had to get them to figure it out. So that was a bit of a hassle. We also looked at DocAv. I know some folks who love DocAv. It's a great tool also. Depending on how technical and how complicated your migration is, it's a good tool to look at. I just love ShareGate. It's simple. It's easy to use. It understands content types. You can bring over pieces. You can bring over site columns. You can bring over content types. You can bring over data. All of them will bring over the lists, the libraries, all three of those tools, and I'm sure there are other ones as well nowadays that I haven't researched because I haven't had a need to use, will bring over custom fields and forms, or you can bring just data or individual items. I liked being able to use ShareGate because we had some data where you brought it over and you could set a key and it would migrate. And there were some, though, that were crazy, some really crazy lists that I had to bring data over where I would actually have to go through and ShareGate would have me manually choose what kind of metadata to select in order to get it migrated properly. So you're going to run into things like that as well. So data is going to be something you're going to have to plan for also, how you're going to validate the data that came over is accurate. Third-party apps, again, if the vendor that you got your third-party app from in your current version of SharePoint still provides something for SharePoint Online, you'll have to check with them and see, do they have a migration path for it? If not, then you'll have to evaluate, maybe if you're lucky, some of the things are available now in the most current version of SharePoint that weren't available at the time that they were purchased, and that might save you some money. Lookup limitations. We're all familiar with those. Get a list or a library that has more than 5,000 items in it, and you're in trouble. Now, when we have on-prem systems that we control, I'm sure that many of you, if you have any lists or libraries that have more than 5,000 items in it, you've done the same things that I've done at organizations I've worked at. We went in and we changed that limit. If we needed 10,000, we upped it. If we needed 7,000, we upped it. If we needed 20,000, we upped it. You can't do that on SharePoint Online. You have no control over it, so you're stuck with 5,000. I can tell you that I had to work with a list that had 75,000 items in it, and it was not fun. We had to put it in. I put it in manually. It took me almost a week to enter all the data. And once it was in there, we couldn't use a default view, because the default view, of course, shows everything. And once you try to do that and it's more than 5,000 items, you get an error message, and so does everyone else. So we had to make a custom view, and we had to create that as default that was guaranteed to have less than 5,000 items in it. Updating it, we used a lot of Power Automate, which I prefer to call Flow. We used a lot of Flow to go through and do updates to the data in there. And when the users had to, fortunately, only update the entire list once a year, we lucked out, because they only needed to take, it was a lot of numbers to manage pricing, and they were able to update it by a specific percentage, so we could run a Power Automate workflow through it and have it automatically update by whatever the increment was. But you're going to have to rethink some of those lists and libraries that have large numbers on. If people need to be able to see more than 5,000, you're going to have to get creative with that. Initially, the content editor web part was the first thing I noticed on pages that was missing, and we missed that a lot. If you are working in the modern SharePoint sites, you're going to miss that. We don't have anything that works exactly like it unless you know how to code your own HTML, and we don't expect all our users to do that. Although there are more web parts. I used to also miss things like the content query web part and the content search web part, because those are so very, very powerful. However, there is a new highlights web part in modern sites that I've noticed in the last 6 months has gotten much more complex. That it's almost a combination of the two. So I'm really excited about that, even though I wasn't previously. Again, whether your teammates can get to the site or not. If you have folks who are trying to reach your site that are external to the organization, you're going to have to evaluate whether there are issues. If they're also in the cloud, that can cause issues. If you're a commercial client and you have government customers that you need to access your SharePoint site, you're going to run into trouble. Some of the government sites will allow if you work with the network security group, they'll allow it. But in most cases, especially if it's DoD related, you're going to find you're going to have to come up with another solution. It's not going to be fun. Even if it's commercial to commercial, if you have external users, we ran into the situation where their tenant was restrictive, and you need to be able to enable an exchange of data between more than one tenant. If that happens, you're going to have to talk to your client's technical folks and have them talk to your technical folks and make that happen. But it absolutely can. However, during migration, sometimes that becomes a bottleneck with trying to get the right people together to make that happen. And then last but not least, probably one of the other biggest issues we ran into technically was what happened to our homepage. When we did a migration, even though it was from Classic to SharePoint Online, the default page disappeared, and all of a sudden, all my homepage content was gone. I went, whoa, where did that go? It had to have been migrated. Well, it was there. It just wasn't in the site pages library. And it's not. And in order to get it to show up, we had to go in with SharePoint Designer and we had to make some tweaks to change the template because the default.aspx page has its own template and it doesn't match up with SharePoint Online. Now, once you take out the pieces that you need to take out using SharePoint Designer from that page template, you can actually get to it and get it to open up. And then you can set it as the home page. SharePoint Online will do it. The new version will do it, whether it's in classic mode or, well, you would have to have it in classic mode. It will set the home page. However, we discovered that since it's not in the site pages library, it doesn't retain versions. So if you need version history on that page, that's another problem. So the best thing that we came up with, although it was very time consuming, was we literally, in many cases, ended up creating a new homepage. We had to recreate the homepage using a page within Site Pages library so that we had all of our versioning, we had all of our content, and everything was there as expected. So you're going to need to plan for some or all of these when you're doing your migration. They're the kinds of things you're going to run into that you're going to need extra time to work out. It definitely, there were a couple of times we set goals for ourselves for when we wanted to finish migrations and we didn't meet them because of those kinds of issues. So timing, you can make your best guess on how long it's going to take for a lot of these things. But if you have a complex site, it's going to probably take longer than you think. You're going to run into something you're not expecting when you start actually migrating the data. Costs, of course, we have to look at those based on how much time we think it's going to take and whether we need to hire outside help to help us. Another issue is user adoption. I mentioned it earlier in the presentation because there have been articles written on how we all go out, we spend tons of money implementing SharePoint or upgrading to the newest version of SharePoint, but we spend almost nothing in time and money talking to the actual users, the people who are the content owners, the people who are going to SharePoint to share a document, collaborate. And we need to consider that and plan for user adoption. Show them what's there, show them how to use it, and find a way to let them know that it's going to make their life easier. It's not going to be just another change that's harder. I mean, all of us are sitting here with change. The last time I gave this presentation, I was up standing in front of an audience and I could see all of your faces. And today I can. I'm looking at a camera. Everybody hates change. I would much rather see all of you and be able to make eye contact and tell when you want to raise a hand and ask a question and find out what works best for you, or if you have a specific need without having to go through a chat to do it. But it's what we have to do. We have to adapt. Well, all users are like that. All of us are like that. The world is a different place than it was a year ago. And a year from now, it'll probably be even more different. So user adoption is something you want to really think about. Two other things that we ran into is you're probably going to find that you have some sites within your environment to migrate where the owner just goes AWOL on you. You ask for their assistance, you try to get their assistance, you might get someone who works that they report to tell them to give you assistance, and they still might not cooperate. I imagine all of us have had that, and so you do the best that you can. But plan on having that built into your timeline as well if you know you have some folks that are like that. And there's, of course, turnover, whether it's someone on your team or someone on your client's team, where you have to work with them to get your migration set up in the new environment for them, and somebody critical goes on maternity leave, or they have an accident and they're out. Those things happen. And hopefully you don't lose anybody who's important on your technical team. Mitigating that, all of these risks, the best you can do is to plan. Again, we get back to that first phase, the whole planning process. Think about what your governance is going to be. Do you already know how you want to provision sites? What if somebody needs something new? How are you going to handle that? Do you have an approval process? Business process mapping, use a diagram. I'll show you in a minute when we get through these that it actually, go ahead and let's go there. I look at these two things. I'm used to people give me, oh, here's my business process. They send me a big email or they give me a Word document. And after a while, as you can see, I kind of blurred out to clean up some of the things in here. That's what looking at all of those words, that's what it starts to do with my brain. And it does for a lot of users too, when you document what the process is and ask them to look at it and tell you if it's correct or not, versus giving somebody a picture. When I give you a picture, I can go, oh yeah, no, yep, this, yep, I have to make a decision here. And if I do, yep, that's what happens. But oh, you're missing a step right here. A picture is just huge in documenting the business process. I don't know how many times when I've had to build workflows or we've had to plan for building custom workflows that having that diagram was critical. If you are in a situation where you have offered to your client that, hey, you want to help them streamline this process since we're going to move it, we've got to make adjustments, what would the ideal work look like for you and the ideal process? Using a diagram is going to help make sure that everybody is in sync on what you're building. And that way you can also use it for change management purposes. If somebody comes in and says, hey, yeah, we need to add another decision point, or when it gets to this point, we need to do this process, you can use that diagram to say, look, this is what we're building. Anything else is a change. And then everybody kind of has to agree to it because you can see it. You can physically see what that change is supposed to be. By doing that in all of these things, it also helps you then prioritize requirements. If you have a list, if you can make yourself a list of what all the requirements are and prioritize them, then you can work with your subject matter expert or your point of contact for each group and determine what do they absolutely have to have first. And can you do it in a phased approach? Can we get the data over? Can we get the basics in place? And then can we work on the enhancements, additional workflows, additional publishing, any kind of special web parts? Can we do those later or not in order to help us meet a timeline? Weekly status meetings, I have had folks say to me, well, why do you schedule a meeting every week? We've got to have 2 weeks in our sprint to do development. Schedule a status call with your client every week. Do it for 30 minutes and then set the expectation with them that some days you're going to have a lot of information and a lot of questions for them as you're going through this process, and you're going to need to schedule extra meetings. But let them know that there are going to be days that you're going to have this status meeting and you might not have anything to report other than we're still working on what we talked about last week. I'll have an update later in the week or next week, and your meeting's 5 minutes. But by doing that, your client, whoever you're reporting to and that you're interacting with, will never feel like they've been left out of the process, and they'll know what's going on, and no one will get a big surprise if something comes up and the timeline gets stalled. If you can build a timeline calendar that actually looks like a physical calendar for those people who you're migrating content for, so that you can let them know, hey, we had to build this new piece and you're going to need to test it in our development environment for us to make sure it works the way that it's supposed to. This is new work for them. They've still got their regular business process that they have to go through every day. The more advanced notice you can give them with a plan, especially if it's something visual on a calendar like what they would see in Outlook, that they can add to their calendar, then they'll be able to carve out a spot of time for them to do that kind of testing for you when it comes up. And then you can always adjust it, of course, at your weekly status calls with them. And then again, user training, plan to train your users. Don't just plan to migrate and throw them to the wolves and say, hey, here, it's SharePoint. It's just SharePoint. Just go there. It works the same as it did before. Because no doubt the controls will be different, especially for those of you that are on SharePoint 2010 and are moving to SharePoint Online. The controls are different. And just spending 30 minutes with those users and saying, hey, you know where manage site contents is? Well, here's where the site actions menu is now. And oh, you know how you used to hover over the name of that file and it had a drop down and you could pick from all these choices? It doesn't do that anymore. Now you have to go look for the ellipsis. Those 3 little dots, they're your friend. That's where all your choices are. So you're going to go looking for that. And when you click on it, guess what? You're going to get all those choices. But if you don't tell them that, it's very clunky and leaves them in a bad place when they have to figure it out themselves. All right, I need to get going here. So we talked about visuals. And then once you get to that point, now you're ready to actually do the migration. So we've done our business process mapping and done our documentation. We've done our evaluations, and we're gonna migrate. And we're gonna know ahead of time that we're gonna have to allocate time for cleanup. One of the things that worked really well for us with some of the groups was to take and do an incremental migration. So we would, while they were still working, depending on what kind of content they had in there, if there weren't a lot of workflows or anything, we would go ahead and migrate their site and then schedule, and then we would go through, see what the new site looked like, do any of our cleanup that we had to do with fixing home pages and any documents or anything else. And then we would coordinate with them a time that didn't interfere with their process, because for some groups, you know, the end of the month or the middle of the month, they had certain things they had to do, reports they had to pull, so that we weren't interfering with that. We would schedule a time, whether it was a day or over a weekend or even a week, and say, okay, this is when we're going to do your migration. We'd already migrated most of their content. We would just go back and do an incremental and pick up what was left, and it made the process then very easy. It also meant that if you migrated the initial content, you had the opportunity to get your subject matter expert, your point of contact with that team, to go in and take a look ahead of time and see if there was anything that jumped out at them as being missing or that needed adjustments. And don't forget to do follow-up. Follow-up really is what you need. You need to worry about data validation and then that transitional training, because if you don't, you're just going to go into a big black hole. And people are going to end up looking at it as, this was really not fun. I didn't like it. I didn't want to do it. When if you do all of those things, then what you're going to end up with is people who are excited about what they're getting. Last but not least, I want to leave you with some SharePoint resources. I know everybody knows that they can go to Google, and there is, of course, the SharePoint resources by just going to Microsoft and looking up SharePoint and getting the documentation. The other things that I like to reference is the help and learning, which is for getting started. And it's really good for using with training users as well. The SharePoint blog helps keep you, and the community and the roadmap, keep you up on what's changing, because everything changes constantly. And these are resources that you're going to continue to use after the migration. Every week there's something new that comes out. It isn't always every week that it's SharePoint, but sometimes almost every week there's something with Teams or OneDrive and SharePoint or with Exchange. And you're going to have to keep on top of it. If you're an admin or you're managing, interacting with your users, you're going to have to keep on top of what's changing and be prepared to do some training on what those changes are. If you have someone on your team, and maybe it's you, that's interested in those end users and doing the best you can with getting them to be good users who adopt this new version of SharePoint, Microsoft offers through EDX their Microsoft Service Adoption Specialist training. If you want to, you can get a certification as well. You just have to pay for it up front before you take the actual class. They give you some fantastic resources. They give you a whole process for how to get your users online. It's absolutely a fantastic thing to do. I did it last year, and it's definitely been helpful. It also puts you in touch with the community. And I just want to remind everyone to please thank our sponsors. We wouldn't have this awesome opportunity if it wasn't for them. And feedback, please. Any feedback is well received. I'm hoping to do this again for other groups, as well as hopefully some other work on Teams, because I love SharePoint. And if you don't realize it, Teams has got SharePoint on the back end of it also. So you have to work with both in order to understand everything. And of course, on the event, our organizers would love to have feedback on the event so far. I don't know if we're going to have any time for a lot of comments, but here's my contact information. You can email me directly, connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me know that it's from here, though, because if I don't know you, otherwise I'm not going to accept your invitation. I will post the slides up through my LinkedIn profile. You'll be able to find them. I'll put them on SlideShare and get them attached up there by the end of today. And that's everything I have. Does anybody have any questions? Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we have time for questions. I've been waiting. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to cut you off too soon. Thank you. So we're getting some feedback. Thank you so much. This is a great presentation. Excellent information. Excuse me. So let's go with the first question. Going back to the migration tools, are there,
Mhm.
what's the most cost-effective tools? Like how cost-effective are some of the tools in your opinion?
Oh, wow. To be honest with you, I haven't had to evaluate pricing on all of them. I can tell you that DocAv and Metalogics are definitely much more expensive than ShareGate. ShareGate's probably one of the less expensive ones. Now, I was talking to a colleague the other day who was telling me that they were actually using some other tools, and I am not familiar with the other ones. Those are the three big ones that most of us use, especially with large migrations. But ShareGate's really cost effective, even if it's a smaller migration. And it's really easy to use.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. ShareGate, I know it's like $4,000 a license for
Yeah.
unlimited content, and
Yeah.
I don't think the other ones can touch that
Yeah.
number there.
Yeah, because everybody else goes by how much. So if you have several terabytes of data, it's going to cost you.
Yeah, let's go into, let's see. So I definitely agree with you on the meetings with the status meetings. Like what I've found is that the meetings actually teaching them about the new terminology with like SharePoint Online, like what's a modern site, what's a
Yep.
hub, what's a team, what's a new team site, what's an Office
Yeah.
365 group. That seems to be like what really kind of drags on those meetings, and just kind of informing the clients. Do
Yep.
you have any inf best practices, like specifically like modernization? How would you handle that? Taking like a 2010, 2013 page, recreating it in the modern look. That seems to be what everybody is interested in.
Well, it depends on what you want to do. You have to start thinking differently. And that's the biggest thing, is that if you're going to use the modern look, you have to think about how you're designing, because we used to be able to kind of put anything anywhere we wanted. And now you have to think, like, pretend you're building it in a table in Word, and you've got a one column table and you've got rows, and you're putting your information in. That's where I start with the folks that I'm training on how to use modern sites, is you have to think about, you're building rows, and what kind of information do you want in the rows, and how do you want to put it in there? And sometimes you have to just play with it a little bit in order to see what it can do. I'm excited because there are some new fun web parts. I miss some of the old ones, but I can still add lists and libraries if I want to. But there are things like, I added one today. Yesterday, I did a countdown for a group. They're having a migration for a different system, and we put a countdown on the team site showing when that was going to happen. We were able to put a world calendar and the weather for all the offices. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, having the clocks and the weather. That's like a
Yeah.
huge. Everybody wants the weather on.
Yeah.
They wanted the weather. So being able to do that's really simple. Okay, so let's see. Anything about specific, like what happens to the SharePoint user profiles when you migrate? Like say on-prem, they're the My Sites, and then what happens? Are they Delve? Are they My Sites? Like what happens with that?
They do come over they do come over when you bring people over. It does connect them, and they do show up in Delve. But I don't remember us having to go in, and whether I am not sure that I have done a migration where I had to go see if the content actually came over from My Sites to Delve on their personal profile. Usually, what comes over is whatever happens to be an Active Directory.
Right, just like auto sync in
Yeah,
the
and
new
then you have to
profile.
go in and add anything else in there that you want to.
Okay. One last question, and let's see. Okay, any recommendations on the best way to build hybrid environments? M365, SharePoint on-prem to 2013. Anything you
Oh
can leave
boy.
with us there? I know that's a loaded one.
Oh, yeah, that's a loaded one. And honestly, what I would tell you is I don't personally have a recommendation for that, but I know that there are some fantastic architects out there that would be able to help you better with making that decision. And that's going to be folks that are working more with the security end of things as well. Because I know, like, I previously worked with some of you, if you go to these conferences, are may be familiar with, like Liam Cleary. He's an MVP. There are a number of other ones as well out there that I am sure we could get an answer for that, but I do not have a specific answer off the top of my head. I know that most of the time when people set up hybrid, they would set up 2019 to connect to it if they're able to do that, but you can certainly do it with 2016 also.
All right, great. I'm just looking. It doesn't look like there's any more questions. Lots of great information. I know I learned something here. So exciting stuff. I want to thank you so much for presenting to our group here. I think this is a fantastic session. If there's any other questions, feel free. Best way to connect with Karen is to go on her LinkedIn or find her on Twitter and download her slides that way. I know we're going to get questions about the slides.
Yep.
That'll be the quickest. And yeah, I appreciate you posting them as soon as possible, because people get real hungry for this stuff.
I know.
They love the slides. All right. So, and again, anybody else, any questions, feel free to send them over. We'll forward them to Karen after the fact, but we'll get set up for our next session. So stay tuned and thank you again. All right. Thanks again, Karen.